एयरटेल मनी, बात सिर्फ पैसों की नहीं है।
All three of you have made, strong arguments against the introduction of a negative list this year. Can I try and argue it the other way around, right? From what I understand, despite the fact that services is what leads this economy and contributes roughly 60% of GDP, our revenues from service tax account for less than 10% of GDP is what I understand. Only 16% of the sector is taxed. Now, in a year when the need to raise revenue is that high or that desperate, isn't there... What else can he do to be able to yield more taxes from this sector, something that he desperately needs to do, also in the context of the fact that the services sector has provided some buoyancy to the indirect tax collection over the course of the last 8 to 10 months, despite the fact that the rest of industry has been in a bit of a funk. So what else can he do besides expand the number of services under tax? And the best way to probably do that is bring in the negative list. Vivek?
Not necessarily. There are sectors which are identified which we know are outside the service tax net. There's less revenue in these niche areas within the general corporate framework of business. But there are sectors such as railway transport. There are sectors such as healthcare. So he could bring those in.
But you yourself have pointed out that every time he's tried to introduce service tax in those sectors, it's met with great degree of opposition, from the Janta, so to speak. So, I mean, what is going to change his view on that? If he hasn't been able to introduce it for all these years, then this year he might say, I don't want to fight all those small individual battles. I'll just bring in a negative list.
So if he brings in a negative list, the affected sectors are not going to throw up their hands and say, okay, where do I file my for a service tax registration? He'll have those battles on his hand. What he could possibly do is pick one of those sectors or two of those sectors, depending on what his sense is in terms of the maturity of that sector and so on.
So for instance, what would you prescribe if he wants to substantially up the yield from service tax revenues?
The word substantially is a problem, but one thing that I'm kind of expecting is that there was one item in the negative list that leasing of residential property over 1 lakh in rent. So I expect that to come in. Whether it will or won't, we'll have to see, but that's something which is not a political football kind of
Rohan, this is going to be piecemeal, right? He can keep doing this for this year, next year, keep bringing in a few more sectors or few more businesses under the service tax net, fight the opposition on that individually, maybe roll some back in the middle of the year. Instead, isn't it just better for him to bring in a negative list? Everyone's complaining, he can't roll it back for everybody. It just becomes an easier problem to manage.
A negative list is, really his final outreach. I mean, he goes out, he says everything is taxable, save and except the limited number of items he chooses to exclude. And yes, if we are saying that continually any situation of government deficit for whatsoever reason has to be met from tax, then yes, he will reach out.
But isn't that the case, Rohan? That's always been the case.
It has. The question is, he now sort of plays his last card. Because if you have these issues on fiscal management the year after and the year after, what is going to happen? The only elasticity he now has, he's taxed everything he could if he brings in the negative list. He can reach out to what is excluded, or the rate effectively goes up, or the credit reduces. Now all of that ultimately we have to understand is making it so difficult to do business in this country, because the cost of doing business here is now at an unprecedented high. You will take it higher, and it isn't that it isn't affecting industries. We are seeing some of the best and ablest in Indian industry also choosing to invest outside. And I think somewhere there has to be a reality which matches up these issues. Your need for revenue versus what it is doing to people wanting to undertake commercial activity in this country.
What is so peculiar about the imposition of service tax in this country that industry can argue against it, whereas it is actually a reality everywhere else in the world?
I mean, I wouldn't argue against the service tax.
Expanding the net of service tax, bringing in a negative list, otherwise everything is piecemeal.
No, what you have to understand is, world over, the situation, you only tax a value addition at each stage, and you get full credit for all antecedent tax. You don't have that mechanism here today. Constitutionally, half your taxes are by the state, half are by the center, and both of them are continuously grabbing at each other's pie. And the moment you pay a VAT or the moment you pay a central tax, there is no fungibility in terms of tax credit.
Is this what will get fixed when GST is introduced as a compulsory?
Hopefully it will.
So he must logically wait for GST if he doesn't want to create a disenabling environment for business.
Right. And one more, just to add to what Rohan has said, while the as far as the scoping of services that are subjected to service tax is being broad-based, the availability of input credit is being narrowed down. So there is a dichotomy of approach there.
Okay. Considering that all of you are arguing against service tax, is it then a foregone conclusion that if he's discouraged so heavily from bringing in a negative list, the only option he has in front of him is to raise the rate on the existing services that are taxed, which is from 10 to 12?
Yeah, that seems likely. That seems something which should not create the kind of fierce opposition that I anticipate these sectors might give him in terms of the negative list.
Is that going to yield him the revenue he needs to be able to balance the books?
Two things. One is he could raise the rate, and secondly there are a whole series of exempted items, for example in excise. Last year he brought in 130,
right.
This year I think he'll bring 250 more. So, those issues will bring him the revenue. But, this whole situation of how much revenue does the government need, the fact that there is a mismatch and therefore you will sort of tax more or you will have more onerous interpretation, I think somewhere we just have to de-link this. You can't tax based on need of government. You have to tax on the basis of the competitiveness of industry.
What country do you live in, Rohan? Because, I mean, in the country we live in right now, balancing the books is a really precarious job.
See, the situation is not what you and I live in. The question is how long will industry sustain in terms of these completely unpredictable tax costs. And that is really the larger issue which will haunt us. And somewhere he has to address it. Yes, he has to balance his books, but he can only balance his books if more people want to do more business in this country.
So, in the face of all this opposition against a negative list, it seems that a raise or a rise in the tax rate is an easier one to digest, and that will not lead to considerable amount of opposition if he's able to position it well, saying, look, I didn't bring in a negative list, now you can't complain about a 10 to 12%.
Absolutely, I completely agree. Increase in interest rate on services from 10 to 12% is more or less a given thing, taking into consideration that the goods are being charged on an average about 20% excise duty and VAT put together.
So, still none of you have been able to answer my question on whether that is going to bring in, the reality being he needs revenue, that is going to bring in any substantial amount of revenue, even if it's not the amount that he actually needs. Is it?
It will partially.
But it will not balance his books.
Right.
10 to 12% is a substantial increase.
So what options does that leave him? And now we come to the close of our discussion. What options does that leave him on account of service tax? Is there anything else that he can do outside of bring in maybe one or two new businesses in, raise the rates? Are you expecting anything else that could substantially impact the amount of money he earns from service tax? And also, are you expecting anything else that corporates should prepare to face? Ron?
I think you've sort of pretty much pushed the envelope as far as you can after the negative list. So if he brings that in, he's pretty much covered, a lot of areas he can go. As I said, there are only two issues: higher rates, lesser credits. And all of those, to my mind, are negative.
That's what I said. Broad-basing the service tax, that is increasing the scope of services and narrowing down the input credit so that he can increase his service tax collections apart from increasing the service tax rate, and he would try to implement the negative list.
See, let's look at it a little
You're
differently.
a minority, Vivek.
Yeah, I sometimes am. Let's look at it a little differently. Let's say he brings in a GST and it's a perfect tax, etc. There's nothing there's nothing he can do administratively at that stage other than look at buoyancy in the economy. So maybe we are reaching that stage on the service tax front, that there are some sectors that are outside, but for legitimate reasons or whatever, we can't touch them yet, and there's not much else he can do. He will get more money if the economy booms. That is what will happen at some stage under the GST regime.
And I think, fundamentally the question we've never asked and addressed is, what will we do outside of taxes to ensure that people are encouraged to undertake more commercial activity, more investment? Because that is what has a direct correlation to what tax he collects. And repeatedly, year after year, we refuse to answer that question.
All right, on that note, I'm going to wrap it up. All three of them here hope it doesn't happen, but 2 out of 3 believe that Pranab Mukherjee will bring in a service tax negative list this budget in an attempt to bring more services under the tax net and to shore up revenue. On our next show, we ask the question, will STT stay or go?